the shadow that wasn't hers. The first time Emily noticed the shadow, she was walking home from school. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden rays across the pavement, and her own shadow stretched out before her, a familiar companion. But as she turned the corner onto her quiet suburban street, something felt off. She glanced down and froze. There were two shadows trailing her. The second shadow was darker, thicker, and slightly out of sync with her movements. When she stopped, it kept moving for a fraction of a second before halting. When she raised her hand to brush her hair out of her face, the shadow's arm lifted a moment later, as if mimicking her. Emily's heart pounded. She spun around, expecting to see someone behind her, but the street was empty. No one was there. She shook her head, trying to convince herself it was a trick of the light. Shadows couldn't just exist on their own, right? She quickened her pace, her sneakers slapping against the pavement. The second shadow stayed with her, matching her stride. By the time she reached her house, she was practically running. She slammed the door shut behind her and leaned against it, breathing hard. "Emily? Is that you?" Her mom called from the kitchen. "Yeah, it's me," Emily replied, her voice shaky. She glanced down at the floor. Her shadow was normal again, just one dark shape stretching out in the afternoon light. She let out a relieved breath. It must have been her imagination. But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The moonlight streamed through her window, casting faint shadows on the walls. She turned onto her side, facing away from the window, and closed her eyes. Just as she was about to drift off, she heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the rustle of fabric. Her eyes snapped open. There, on the wall opposite her bed, was the shadow. It wasn't her shadow. She wasn't moving, but it was. It raised its arm slowly, deliberately, and pointed at her. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow tilted its head, as if studying her, and then it stepped off the wall. Emily scrambled back against the headboard, her heart racing. The shadow moved across the floor, gliding silently toward her bed. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying it would disappear. When she opened them again, the shadow was gone. But the feeling of dread lingered, heavy and suffocating. The next morning, Emily tried to convince herself it had been a nightmare. She went through her usual routine, brushing her teeth, getting dressed, eating breakfast, but she couldn't shake the unease that clung to her like a second skin. At school, she was distracted, jumping at every noise and constantly checking over her shoulder. Her best friend, Mia, noticed. "Hey, are you okay?" Mia asked during lunch. "You've been acting weird all day." Emily hesitated. She wanted to tell Mia about the shadow, but it sounded crazy even to her. "I'm fine," she said finally. "Just didn't sleep well last night." Mia gave her a skeptical look but didn't press further. Emily was grateful. She didn't know how to explain what she'd seen, or what she thought she'd seen. That afternoon, as Emily walked home, the shadow returned. This time, it was more aggressive. It didn't just mimic her movements. It exaggerated them. When she waved her hand, the shadow's arm flailed wildly. When she took a step, the shadow lunged forward. Emily's stomach churned. She broke into a run, but the shadow kept pace, growing larger and darker with every step. By the time she reached her house, she was trembling. She burst through the door and slammed it shut, leaning against it as if to keep the shadow out. But when she looked down, she saw it seeping under the door, a pool of darkness spreading across the floor. Emily backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The shadow rose from the floor, taking on a humanoid shape. It had no face, no features, but she could feel its gaze on her. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't respond. It simply tilted its head again, as if considering her. Then it lunged. Emily screamed and ducked, covering her head with her arms. When she looked up, the shadow was gone. But the air felt heavier, colder, and she knew it wasn't over. The mimic. The days that followed were a blur of fear and exhaustion. The shadow didn't leave Emily alone. It appeared at random times, sometimes in the corner of her eye, sometimes right in front of her, always just out of reach. It mimicked her every move, but with a delay that made her skin crawl. When she brushed her teeth, the shadow's hand would rise a second later, clutching an invisible toothbrush. When she sat down to eat, the shadow would pull out an invisible chair and sit across from her, its faceless gaze fixed on her. Emily tried to ignore it, to convince herself it wasn't real. But the shadow was becoming harder to dismiss. It was growing bolder, more intrusive. One night, as she lay in bed, she felt a cold presence beside her. She turned her head slowly, dreading what she might see. The shadow was lying next to her, its form shifting and rippling like smoke. It reached out a hand, and Emily felt an icy touch on her arm. She jerked away, scrambling out of bed and backing into the corner of the room. "Leave me alone," she shouted, her voice trembling. The shadow sat up, its head tilting in that unnerving way. It didn't speak, but Emily felt its intent as clearly as if it had shouted at her. It wanted her. It wanted her. The next morning, Emily was a wreck. She hadn't slept, and dark circles hung under her eyes. Her mom noticed immediately. "Emily, are you feeling okay?" she asked, placing a hand on Emily's forehead. "You look pale." "I'm fine," Emily mumbled, pulling away. She couldn't tell her mom about the shadow. Her mom would think she was crazy, just tired. Her mom gave her a worried look but didn't push further. Emily grabbed her backpack and headed to school, her mind racing. She needed help, but who could she turn to? Mia was her best friend, but even Mia might not believe her. And if she did, what could she do? This wasn't something a teenager could handle. At school, Emily's anxiety only grew. The shadow followed her everywhere, lurking just out of sight. During math class, she saw it in the reflection of the whiteboard standing behind her. She spun around, but the classroom was empty. The other students stared at her, whispering and giggling. Emily's face burned with embarrassment. "Emily, is something wrong?" her teacher asked, frowning. "No," Emily muttered, sinking back into her seat. She kept her eyes on her desk for the rest of the class, but she could feel the shadow's presence, cold and oppressive. After school, Emily decided to do some research. If the shadow was a spirit, maybe she could find a way to get rid of it. She went to the library and checked out every book she could find on ghosts, spirits, and the supernatural. She spent hours poring over the texts, looking for anything that might explain what was happening to her. Most of the books were useless, filled with vague theories and unhelpful advice. But one book caught her eye. It was an old, dusty volume titled Shadows and Specters, a guide to the unseen world. The book was filled with strange symbols and diagrams, and the language was difficult to understand, but one passage stood out. When a shadow mimics the living, it is not a mere reflection. It is a spirit trapped between worlds, seeking to claim a body for its own. The shadow will grow stronger with time, feeding on the fear and energy of its host. To banish it, one must confront it in its own realm, where it holds no power. Emily's heart raced as she read the words. This was it. This was what she was dealing with. But how was she supposed to confront the shadow in its own realm? The book didn't provide any clear instructions. Frustrated, she slammed the book shut and rubbed her temples. She needed more information. That night, Emily decided to try something risky. She waited until her parents were asleep, then crept downstairs to the living room. She lit a candle and placed it on the coffee table, along with the book and a piece of paper. She had read about seances in one of the other books, and while she wasn't sure if it would work, she was desperate. "If you can hear me," she whispered, staring into the flame, "I want to talk to you." The room grew colder, and the candle flickered. Emily's breath came out in visible puffs. She felt a presence behind her and turned slowly. The shadow was there, looming over her. It was larger than before, its form more defined. It had no face, but Emily could feel its hunger, its desire. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice shaking. The shadow didn't speak, but it reached out a hand, pointing at her chest. Emily's heart pounded. It wanted her body. It wanted to take over. "No," she said firmly, standing up. "You can't have me." The shadow tilted its head, then lunged at her. Emily stumbled back, knocking over the candle. The flame went out, plunging the room into darkness. She felt the shadow's cold hands on her shoulders, pushing her down. She struggled, but it was too strong. Just as she thought it was over, a voice echoed in her mind. A voice that wasn't hers. "You cannot escape me," Emily screamed, and the shadow recoiled, as if her voice had heard it. She scrambled to her feet and ran upstairs, locking herself in her room. She leaned against the door, her chest heaving. The shadow didn't follow her, but she knew it wasn't gone. It was waiting, the descent. Emily didn't sleep that night. She sat on her bed, clutching the old book she had borrowed from the library, her eyes darting to every corner of the room. The shadow hadn't returned, but she could still feel its presence, like a cold weight pressing down on her chest. The voice she had heard, its voice, echoed in her mind, sending shivers down her spine. "You cannot escape me." She opened the book again, flipping through the pages frantically. There had to be something, anything, that could help her. She couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over her shoulder, waiting for the shadow to strike. She needed to fight back. Near the back of the book, she found a chapter titled "The Realm of Shadows." Her heart leapt as she began to read. The Realm of Shadows is a parallel dimension, a place where spirits and lost souls reside. It is a world of darkness and mirrors, where the boundaries between the living and the dead are blurred. To enter this realm, one must perform a ritual at the threshold of midnight, using a mirror as a gateway. Beware, for once you cross into the shadow world, there is no guarantee of return. Emily's hands trembled as she read the instructions. The ritual required a mirror, a black candle, and a drop of her own blood. It sounded dangerous, but what choice did she have? The shadow wasn't going to leave her alone. If she wanted to be free, she had to face it on its own turf. She waited until the next night, when her parents were asleep, to gather the supplies. She found a small hand mirror in her mom's dresser and a black candle in the basement. The blood part made her nervous, but she pricked her finger with a safety pin and let a single drop fall onto the mirror's surface. The blood sizzled and vanished, leaving behind a faint, smoky residue. At exactly midnight, Emily sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, the mirror in front of her and the candle lit beside it. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The book had warned her to focus her mind and visualize the shadow world, but it was hard to concentrate when every creak of the house made her jump. "I call upon the realm of shadows," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I seek to enter your domain." The candle flame flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Emily's reflection in the mirror wavered, as if the glass had turned to liquid. She leaned closer, her heart pounding. The room seemed to grow colder, and the air felt heavy, like she was underwater. Suddenly, her reflection changed. It wasn't her anymore. It was the shadow. Its faceless form stared back at her, its head tilting in that familiar, unnerving way. Emily gasped and tried to pull away, but the mirror's surface rippled, and a cold hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. She screamed, but no sound came out. The shadow pulled her forward, and she felt herself being dragged into the mirror. The world around her twisted and blurred, colors and shapes melting together in a dizzying swirl. She closed her eyes, unable to bear the sensation, and when she opened them again, she was no longer in her bedroom. She was in the realm of shadows. The world around her was dark and surreal. The ground beneath her feet was black and glassy, reflecting a dim, gray sky. Strange, twisted trees loomed in the distance, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick and cold, and every sound was muffled, as if she were standing in a vast, empty cavern. Emily looked around, her heart racing. She was alone, or so she thought. As she took a step forward, she heard a soft, echoing laugh. She spun around, but there was no one there. The laugh came again, this time from behind her. She turned again, and this time she saw it. The shadow. It stood a few feet away, its form more solid than before. It had no face, but Emily could feel its gaze on her, cold and calculating. It raised a hand, and the ground beneath her feet shifted, forming a circle of mirrors around her. Each mirror reflected her terrified face, but as she watched, her reflections began to change. They twisted and distorted, becoming versions of her that were wrong. Too tall, too short, too thin, too wide. Some had hollow eyes, others had too many teeth. They reached out toward her, their hands pressing against the glass. Emily backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The shadow stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. It pointed at her, and the mirrors began to close in, trapping her in a shrinking circle. She could feel the cold glass pressing against her skin, the distorted versions of herself whispering in her ear. "You belong to us. You can't escape. We are you." Emily screamed, covering her ears. She couldn't let this happen. She had to fight back. She closed her eyes and focused on the book's instructions. The shadow world was a place of illusions, it had said. The only way to survive was to see through them. She took a deep breath and opened her eyes. The mirrors were still there, but she forced herself to look past them, to see the truth beneath the surface. The ground beneath her feet was solid, the air was still, and the shadow was just a shadow. It had no power over her unless she let it. "You're not real," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You're just a shadow." The shadow tilted its head, as if amused. It stepped closer, its form shifting and rippling. Emily stood her ground, refusing to back down. She reached out a hand, and to her surprise, the shadow flinched. It didn't like being touched. She took a step forward, and the shadow took a step back. The mirrors around her began to crack, their surfaces shattering into shards of glass that dissolved into smoke. The distorted versions of herself vanished, leaving only the shadow and Emily. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice growing stronger. "This is my world, not yours." The shadow lunged at her, but Emily was ready. She sidestepped, and the shadow stumbled, its form flickering. It turned to face her, its movements slower now, less confident. Emily realized something. The shadow was afraid of her. It had been feeding on her fear, but now that she was standing up to it, it didn't know what to do. She took another step forward, and the shadow retreated again. It was weakening, its form becoming more transparent. Emily felt a surge of hope. She could do this. She could beat it. But just as she thought she had the upper hand, the ground beneath her feet gave way, and she fell into darkness. The mirror's edge. Emily's fall seemed to last forever. She tumbled through darkness, the air rushing past her, her stomach lurching. She couldn't see anything, couldn't hear anything except the sound of her own panicked breathing. Just when she thought she would fall forever, she landed with a jarring thud on a hard, glassy surface. She groaned, her body aching from the impact. Slowly, she pushed herself up and looked around. She was in a vast, endless hall of mirrors. The walls, the floor, even the ceiling were made of reflective glass, stretching out in every direction. Her own reflection stared back at her from countless angles, each one slightly different, each one wrong in some way. The shadow was nowhere to be seen, but Emily could feel its presence. It was close. She could feel its cold, oppressive energy pressing down on her, making it hard to breathe. She stood up, her legs shaky, and began to walk. The mirrors distorted her reflection, making her look taller, shorter, thinner, wider. Some of the reflections moved on their own, their eyes following her as she passed. "Where are you?" she called out, her voice echoing through the endless hall. "Show yourself." There was no response, but the air grew colder. Emily wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. She needed to find a way out of this place, but every direction looked the same. The mirrors seemed to go on forever, trapping her in a maze of reflections. As she walked, she began to notice something strange. The reflections weren't just distorted, they were changing. Some of them began to smile, their grins too wide, their teeth too sharp. Others began to cry, their tears black and oily. One reflection reached out toward her, its hand pressing against the glass. Emily stopped, her heart pounding. "Let me out," the reflection whispered, its voice eerily similar to her own. "Please, let me out." Emily backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The reflection's hand began to push through the glass, its fingers stretching toward her. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the hall. The mirrors around her began to crack, their surfaces shattering as more reflections reached out, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of pleas and threats. "Let us out. You can't escape. We are you." Emily ran faster, her heart racing. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to get away from the mirrors. The ground beneath her feet began to shift, the glassy surface turning slippery and uneven. She stumbled, falling to her knees. The reflections closed in around her, their hands reaching out, their voices growing louder. "No!" she screamed, covering her ears. "Leave me alone." Just as the hands were about to grab her, a voice cut through the chaos, a voice that wasn't hers. "Emily." She looked up and saw the shadow standing at the end of the hall. His form was more solid now, more defined. It had no face, but she could feel its gaze on her, cold and calculating. It raised a hand, and the reflections froze, their hands inches away from her. The hall fell silent. "What do you want?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling but firm. The shadow didn't respond. It simply pointed at her, then at itself. Emily's stomach churned. It wanted her body. It wanted to take over. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You can't have me." The shadow tilted its head, as if amused. It stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate. Emily scrambled to her feet, backing away. The reflections around her began to move again, their hands reaching out, their voices rising in a deafening chorus. "You can't escape. We are you. You belong to us." Emily turned and ran, her heart pounding. The shadow followed, its form shifting and rippling as it glided across the glassy floor. The mirrors around her began to crack and shatter, their shards flying through the air like daggers. Emily ducked and weaved, trying to avoid the flying glass, but a shard grazed her arm, drawing blood. She cried out, clutching her arm, but she didn't stop running. She could see something up ahead, a doorway, its frame made of twisted, blackened metal. It was the only way out. She ran toward it, her legs burning with effort. The shadow was close behind her, its cold energy pressing down on her. Just as she reached the doorway, the shadow lunged. Emily dove through the doorway, landing hard on the other side. She turned and saw the shadow standing in the doorway, its form flickering. It reached out a hand, but the doorway began to close, the metal frame twisting and warping. The shadow's hand was caught in the closing door, and it let out a soundless scream as its form was torn apart. Emily watched in horror as the shadow was pulled back into the hall of mirrors, its form dissolving into smoke. The doorway slammed shut, leaving her in silence. She was in a new place now, a dark, empty void. There was no ground, no sky, just endless darkness. She felt weightless, as if she were floating. The only light came from a faint, glowing orb in the distance. Emily began to move toward it, her body drifting through the void. As she got closer, she realized the orb was a mirror, a single solitary mirror, floating in the darkness. Its surface was smooth and unbroken, reflecting her own face. She reached out a hand, her fingers brushing against the glass. The surface rippled, and she felt a pull, as if the mirror was trying to draw her in. This was it. This was the way out. But as she prepared to step through the mirror, she heard a voice that wasn't hers. "You can't leave." She turned and saw the shadow, its form flickering and unstable. It was weaker now, but it wasn't gone. It reached out a hand, its fingers brushing against her arm. Emily felt a cold, numbing sensation spread through her body. "No," she said, pulling away. "You can't stop me." The shadow lunged, its form dissolving into smoke as it wrapped around her. Emily struggled, but the smoke was everywhere, filling her lungs, clouding her vision. She felt herself being pulled away from the mirror, back into the void. But she wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not when she was so close. She focused all her energy on the mirror, on the light it represented. She reached out a hand, her fingers brushing against the glass. The surface rippled, and she felt a surge of warmth. The smoke around her began to dissipate, the shadow's grip weakening. With one final effort, Emily stepped through the mirror. The final confrontation. Emily emerged from the mirror gasping for air, her body collapsing onto the cold, familiar floor of her bedroom. The candle she had lit for the ritual had burned out, leaving only a pool of wax and a faint wisp of smoke. The room was silent, the oppressive weight of the shadow world gone. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe it was over, that she had escaped. But then she felt it. A cold, creeping sensation crawled up her spine, and the air around her grew heavy. She turned her head slowly, her heart pounding, and saw it, the shadow. It was smaller now, its form flickering and unstable, but it was still there. It stood in the corner of the room, its faceless gaze fixed on her. "You can't be here," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I left you behind." The shadow tilted its head, as if amused. It stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Emily scrambled to her feet, backing away until she hit the wall. There was nowhere to run. The shadow was in her world now, and it wasn't going to leave. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Why won't you leave me alone?" The shadow didn't respond. It simply raised a hand, pointing at her chest. Emily's breath caught in her throat. It wanted her body. It wanted to take over. "No," she said firmly, shaking her head. "You can't have me." The shadow lunged, its form dissolving into smoke as it rushed toward her. Emily raised her arms instinctively, bracing for impact. But instead of feeling the cold, numbing sensation she had come to expect, she felt warmth. A strange, golden light began to emanate from her chest, pushing back against the shadow's darkness. The shadow recoiled, its form flickering and unstable. It let out a soundless scream, its edges fraying as the light grew brighter. Emily stared in awe, realizing what was happening. The light was coming from her own strength, her own will to survive. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice steady now. "This is my world, not yours." The shadow lunged again, but the light pushed it back, its form dissolving into smoke. Emily stepped forward, her confidence growing with every step. She raised a hand, and the light surged, enveloping the shadow in a golden glow. The shadow let out one final, soundless scream before it was consumed by the light, its form vanishing into nothingness. The room fell silent. The oppressive weight was gone, the air warm and still. Emily sank to her knees, her body trembling with exhaustion. She had done it. She had faced the shadow in its own world and defeated it. But as she sat there, catching her breath, she noticed something strange. The mirror she had used for the ritual was still there, its surface smooth and unbroken. She crawled over to it, her reflection staring back at her. For the first time in weeks, her reflection looked normal, no distortions, no twisted versions of herself. Just her. She reached out a hand, her fingers brushing against the glass. The surface rippled, and for a moment, she thought she saw something. A faint, shadowy figure in the distance. But it was gone before she could be sure. Emily leaned back, letting out a long, shaky breath. It was over. The shadow was gone. She was safe. But as she lay there, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The shadow had been defeated, but it had left its mark on her. She could still feel its cold energy lingering in the back of her mind, a faint whisper that she couldn't quite make out. She shook her head, pushing the thought aside. She had faced her fear and come out stronger. That was what mattered. The shadow was gone, and she was still here. As she got to her feet and began to clean up the remnants of the ritual, she made a promise to herself. She wouldn't let fear control her anymore. She had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. And if the shadow, or anything like it, ever returned, she would be ready. For now, though, she was just glad to be home.